question.
Wait, she's already had it.
Oh, she's got it.
All right, can I shut this door?
Yes.
That's a good question. What Bible would you recommend?
All right, that's much
Can
more.
I ask, which Bible would you recommend for Bible study? Because the one you mentioned last night had faulty footnotes and they were deceptive.
Yeah. Well, I get that question asked a lot because you know, I think it's sort of a, everyone would like to carry one Bible around with them, you know, and say, this is my Bible, you know, my space, this is my Bible. And I don't recommend any one Bible. I just don't, because I've been studying it long enough to know that each Bible has its problems. And this question came up. This question came up before. It's okay, Harold. I'll keep it pointed. Okay? That's one. Each Bible has its faults and has its good points. And the reason for that is that Bible translation is very difficult. It's very difficult to translate, especially from the Greek language. The Greek has its own set of problems, and the Hebrew has its own set of problems as well. And you have to be able to sort them out. But the Greek language is so much different than ours in very many ways. It's a decline language, and we don't have that in English. And the Greeks had many more words than we do, and they had many more ways of saying things in their grammar than we do in English. So it's very hard to put all the Greek nuances in an English translation. For example, the Greeks had 7 tenses, 5 moods, 3 voices. Now you multiply that all out, okay? That's a lot of ways to use one verb, okay? In English, we have 5 tenses and 2 voices, and I think, what, maybe 3 or 4 moods, okay? So we almost have half the ways that the Greeks did to use a verb, just a verb. You know, and then they have different ways to use a noun and an adjective. And so anyway, it's difficult to translate all. And translators struggle with this when they translate. So, like the Douay Rheims. Now, the Douay Rheims is a good translation, and that's because Jerome, when he translated the original Greek into Latin, he did it word for word. He didn't take any liberties with what he thought it might mean. He just, if he saw the word wood, he put the word wood in there, you know, even if it sounded wooden. That's what he did. So he is very faithful. But the problem with that is when you translate word for word sometimes, even though that's good in theory, you just don't get the exact meaning that the Greek author wanted to convey, you see, because it has some underlying grammatical principles at work that just can't be translated properly. Okay, so I'm trying to shorten this all down, but I think it's a very important question for people to know the details of this. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, I like this translation, or I like that translation. It's just not that easy. Okay, so what I recommend people do is get a number of translations and carry one of those around, where carry the RSV around with you for a while, and then carry the Douay Rheims around with you for a while, and get the flavor of these different translations, because they all have something good to say, and they all have their weaknesses. Okay. Now you're talking about Bible study. You said for Bible study, what would I do? And that's what I would do. I would get a number of translations. I have them all. Okay. And if I want to see what one translation may say that another won't, I'll go look it up, and you'll be amazed at the differences among these translations. And then I try to find out the reason why this translation did it this way as opposed to this one. And there may have been a good reason why they did it a little differently. Okay. So now I don't expect you all to be Bible scholars in order to do that. I mean, you have to really know your languages in order to do all this. Okay. But to narrow it down, I would say the Douay Rheims is a very good translation. The RSV, Revised Standard Version, Catholic Edition, which was first published in 1966. And Ignatius did another version of it, but it's still the same version that was issued in 1966. That's a good version to use. Okay. The New American Bible is not a bad Bible at all, as far as the translation is concerned. That's the New American Bible Catholic Edition. That's what the Catholics put out in 1987, I think it was. And the footnotes are just very dangerous. Okay, you just don't read any of the footnotes. But that's hard for people to do. to read the text of the Bible and not slip down to the footnote. Okay, so you have to, especially teenagers or children who are reading the NAB Bible, those footnotes are still there. Okay, and you know, that's where their target is. They want to get those teenagers and have those footnotes in there to prime them, you know, to this new way of thinking about the Bible. You know, so you have to be very careful there. So I hope I've answered the question sufficiently for you, but that's where I would go. Okay, Lawrence,
something related to that is, could you give us an example of one of these erroneous footnotes? And yeah,
I just went through a couple of those last night. You know, where it would say, you know, the story about the Garden of Eden. You know, they'll still intimate that this was not necessarily an historical event. Okay, and you know, there wasn't really a talking snake there, or something of that. Or if you read the book of Jonah, it will say, well, this is a fictional account, something of that nature. Okay, and there's hundreds of these all throughout the text of the NAB. So that's the kind of things you would get.
So I have a youth Bible, it's NAB, and in the beginning of Matthew and some of the letters of St. Paul, it would say that Matthew did not write Matthew, St. Paul did not write this letter, and they would have an explanation why they would come to that conclusion.
Right.
It seems to me that they, I mean, obviously none of them wrote their names, right? At least the gospel writers, and we've gotten that the authors from tradition. So is it because of the kind of collaboration between various denominations and creating the New American Bible, which led to, you know, getting rid of some of these traditions?
Yeah, that's basically the Protestant hermeneutic that's come along, that's infiltrated into the church, where it makes these Catholic scholars question what the tradition has been given to them, that's been passed down. And I would say this, if you want to go question whether Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, the burden of proof is on you, because the tradition has given us the fact that Matthew wrote that Gospel. And no one prior to our 20th century, now the 21st century, has had any evidence to dispute that. Okay, so for 20 centuries we've been given the tradition that Matthew wrote it. The burden of proof then is on someone who's going to challenge that. And if they're going to say that Matthew didn't write it, they better have the evidence to be able to make a footnote in the Bible that says, well, Matthew didn't write Matthew, as if it's a statement of fact. It's not a fact. Okay, they don't know it any more than we know it. You know. But we have the tradition, and that's what we're going to stick by. But see, most of these scholars don't like tradition. Their agenda basically is to get rid of tradition. They think tradition is an obstacle to further knowledge of the Bible. It hinders us. And that's what this whole movement is about, basically. That's why it's called liberal, because you get away from the tradition, you see. And that's where the danger lies. Now, I don't have any qualms about someone challenging an idea in tradition. We can't get to the point where we say, okay, nothing these liberals say is good, and tradition always has the answer. I'm not an advocate of that position. What I am an advocate of is, if you're going to challenge a tradition, you better have solid facts in order to come to these conclusions that you've arrived at. You see, that's the big difference.
How does Magisterium relate with that kind of issue?
The Magisterium, by and large, isn't really involved with all this. You see, what happened in 1943 when Pius XII wrote his encyclical, Divine Afflante Spiritu, was that he gave Catholic scholars the right to use the hermeneutical tools that the Protestants were using a couple centuries prior. And so everybody was all happy now that we can, use these tools for biblical study. And that's basically where the Magisterium left it, that these men could discuss back and forth what the meaning of these texts were based on these new tools. And the Magisterium has never taken one of their conclusions and said, now we're going to make this official doctrine of the Church. Never once. Okay? So, but the impression that's given by these scholars is that the Magisterium is more or less behind this and giving an official sanction to it because these men are in high places. Like the Pontifical Biblical Commission, for example. Just because they have a higher say or more room to voice their opinion about these biblical matters we get the impression from them that this is now the definitive teaching of the Catholic Church, when it's not. The Church has never made any official statement. It allows them to voice their opinion in an authoritative way, for being the commission that was commissioned by the Pope. But even then, in 1971, Paul VI took away the authority that the Pontifical Biblical Commission had prior. When the PBC was established by Pius X, around 1910 or so, it was there under the arm of the Pope. And whatever the PBC said then was considered authoritative, not infallible, but authoritative for Catholics. And that was changed by Paul VI in 1970. So basically, if anything, the PBC's authority has been demoted, you see. So not only was there no official magisterial backing for these new interpretations, the PBC's authority was demoted, you see. So that's another strike against them. And, you know, it's good to know all these things, because as Catholics, we have to be able to distinguish between what is official teaching of the Church and what is just someone's opinion that it's official teaching. And of course, that's all the reason why we have problems with Vatican II, because all these so-called new interpretations of Vatican II are being touted as if they're official teachings of the Church, you see. Yes, Bob?
Bob?
Bob in the back.
The new biblical experts, Karl Rahner, Raymond Brown, Hans Kuhn, were these let in because of that decision in 1943 that they became the so-called experts of Catholic biblical scholarship?
Yeah, there was a movement prior to that. You know, Desjardins was writing in the 1890s. He had already leaned toward that liberal viewpoint. And again, as I said last night, a lot of this came out of the crucible where, you know, Lyell and Darwin were writing their books about evolution. And so the Catholics got on board, you know, Father George Mavar, and there's a whole lot of other Catholic scholars around the 1880s, 1890s, who were pushing for this liberal movement of biblical hermeneutics, long before 1943 came along. The reason that the Pope allowed them to use these officially, these new tools officially, was because there was so much pressure put on them, on the Vatican, to do so. You see, because prior to this, there were like 50 years of scholars saying, well, this is the direction we should go. So the Pope said, okay, fine, you can go use these. But you know, when he wrote that encyclical, Divini Fante Spiritu, he put so many cautions in that encyclical. He says, okay, you can use these tools, but I want to warn you, this was what may happen if you use these tools. And he laid it out, point by point, what could happen. And you know, that's exactly what we see today. Every danger that he pointed out to them is exactly what they're doing today. Of course, he's dead and can't do anything about it, you know, so, yes.
Whenever we read the Bible and we come across something like that, a dilemma, couldn't we go to the Catechism? Because that's been all the way to the Pope and back as to what we believe. Yeah. Couldn't they prove it by going to the Catechism on it to get the truth?
Yeah, sometimes that's possible. Yeah, the Catechism, it's a big book, you know, and sometimes it'll give you a definitive answer on a question like that. Sometimes it won't, though. Okay, so you're still left with some controversy. And the Catechism is written in such a way where, you know, the Catechism has its own methodology and its own agenda, so to speak. And you can just tell by the way it's laid out. You know, the basic structure is to do with the commandments. You know, going through each of the commandments. That's the basic thrust of the whole Catechism there. So it's basically a pastoral book. And sometimes it mixes theology in with it. And when that occurs, then we can use it to answer those questions. And I often do that myself, you know. So yeah, there is an avenue for that, but it's not. It doesn't always work. Now, for example, when the Catechism covers this issue about biblical inerrancy, okay, or biblical inspiration, the Catechism is very careful to stick with the tradition and not really give anybody any room to deviate. But the language sometimes is like, you know, it's a little general, you know, and it's not specific enough. But because that's not the Catechism's purpose. The Catechism's purpose is just to sort of reiterate the truth that we already know and doesn't expect any deviation from it. So it doesn't get into all the technical points. And that's where, as they say, the devil's in the details. Well, that's what happens a lot of times. If the details aren't covered, then people they see a loophole and they'll take advantage of it. You know, and the Catechism might not cover all those details or loopholes. You see, especially like with this. One more point. I'll get to your question. With this clause we covered yesterday, Dei Verbum 11, Vatican II document, it says, "For the sake of our salvation." Okay. Well, the Catechism doesn't really go into the ins and outs of that clause. The only time it mentions it is in that paragraph I read yesterday from the Catechism, where it mentions the clause, but it doesn't debate it as to what it means. Okay? So there's where the Catechism really wouldn't help you to decide that issue. It really takes a lot of scholarly research to decide that issue. Remember which phrase I'm talking about? Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This is something I read in St. Michael's paper. It's like our Sunday Visitor, only it's from Canada. Have you heard of St. Michael's paper?
No.
Okay. Anyway, in this book, in this paper, magazine, it talks about how the scientists were at the lowest ebb of the Earth, as close as they could, as deep as it could go, and they started drilling down. And they drilled down so far, pulled out the drill, and it tells in the paper, I can't remember all the statistics of how far down they got, but anyway, they could hear voices coming out of it, of screaming, you know, and like, you know, the hell, they thought it was hell. And another place they did it, they tried two places, in Switzerland, another low place, they dug down. And the scientists were so scared when they just stopped everything. It was just, they just stopped everything. But it was two places where you were. Have you ever heard of anything of that nature?
Yes, I have heard. I was out a couple of years ago. I didn't hear
all
about
false?
that. No, I don't know. You know, I don't have any basis to judge whether that's false or not, because I wasn't there to see it, and I did no investigation on it, so I couldn't tell you either way whether it's true or false. You mean the story itself?
Well, the way they explained it, they had everything down pat, how far they were going down and everything. I mean, I can't remember all the figures in that because it was just, I read it, wow. You know,
Well, there are some saints that have said that you know, there's a little circle in the earth, you know, where hell might be. Okay, there are some saints, but I doubt if anybody has drilled down that far. You know, I think the most we could drill down is maybe a couple miles. Okay?
Right.
This
was way low and where it was, you know, and so. I don't know.
The distance between the center of the earth and the surface of the earth is 4,000 miles. Okay,
Wow, yes.
there's not a drill that could even come close to that.
No,
All right.
no.
So you know, I would be skeptical about it, but as I say, I haven't investigated it, so I don't know.
That was where that guy was that burned that house down yesterday.
Say it again? What?
That's where the guy is that burned that house down yesterday.
Is that right? Okay.
No, this was actually in the paper, I'm not making that up.
Yeah, yeah.
She saw it too, so.
Yeah, there's. I've heard other stories like that. You know, they've heard screams and stuff from the center of the earth. It's nothing new. So this report is not. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I just want to. At our Bible study, Carlos Turan brought a video with those voices.
Yeah.
It was only about 2 minutes long. Maybe we could ask him again sometime at the Bible study to bring it back. And what he brought, you know, I'm not sure where he got it from.
I'm sorry.
But it was supposed to be a
Everybody's
recording.
there. These people, they're late.
I know.
The doors were locked and we had to come.
Yeah.
It's kind of scary, those voices.
Yeah,
It was about 2 minutes long.
Well, you know, on the other side of that, you know, it's easy for somebody to make a tape of people screaming and report that it's somebody from hell. You know, I have my doubts about that because you know, Jesus said in the parable of Lazarus that, you know, there's a great gulf separating hell from everybody else. And whether they can communicate with us, you know, that's a pretty far-fetched idea. You'd have to have a lot of evidence to be able to prove something like that.
What Lazarus could see though, he could see over there, heaven.
Yeah,
According to the story.
right. But as I said, you know, yes, ma'am.
I don't know, I think last night you said something that confused me, and I'm a very...
Well, that's your fault. It's not mine.
I accept that. Because my next statement was, my brain, I have a real small little brain, and very simple.
Sometimes creatures with the smallest brains are the most intelligent. That's the way God made it.
But you said something about the Holy Spirit. Somebody said something, and then you said something about the Holy Spirit. I don't know if the Holy Spirit would get involved with that or something like that came along. And reading the Bible, especially, I have always put a great faith in the Holy Spirit because I don't know, and I will never know all the things. I will read this book and I still won't know everything that you knew to write that book. If I can't trust the Holy Spirit to help me while I'm reading the Bible, then I might go astray and not even know it. That's scary, you know? I need help when I'm reading the Bible. I can be sent astray very easily. I went to a meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, and somebody told us there that the Old Testament is not literal. You're not supposed to take it literally. And all these things that you are saying that were not true, they're just stories. At that point, I believed that. I didn't like it, but I believed it. Because they did say the New Testament, very literal. You take everything very literally in the New Testament. So I thought, well, thank heaven for that. But and then I heard one time that when you read the Bible, just read it simply. God the Father will let you gain from it what He wants you to gain from it. And don't worry about understanding anything. Am I right or wrong? Do I have to be a scholar to read the Bible?
No.
Can I go astray and not even know it? I mean, those footnotes, I'm not a footnote reader, so,
Yeah, well,
so they didn't catch me with any of that.
Yeah, if you stick close to what the tradition of the church has taught us about Bible interpretation, you can't go astray. And that's where the Holy Spirit is going to lead you. Okay, He's not going to have like an inner voice in you all the time saying, yeah, this is true, that's not true. Okay? He leads us to the church, and the church is the witness for us as to what's true and false. And if the church doesn't cover that particular area that you're reading, well, you can go ask somebody who's in authority in the church. Okay? And nowadays you have to be careful which one you ask. That's what I was trying to tell you last night. Okay? But no, the Bible's written, on a multitude of levels. A little child can read it, an esteemed scholar can read it, and they're going to get their various information out of the Bible.
Good information.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, E equals mc squared, our famous, physical formula. Okay? On the one hand, I could teach a first grader to know what that formula is all about. Energy equals mass times the speed of light. Okay? And he, or a third grader, let's say, who knows multiplication. I could teach him what that theory is all about. And on a very elementary level, he would know something about it. Okay? But, there are scholars who have been studying this formula for their whole lives and still don't understand it because it's so deep, you see. And the Bible's written in the same way. Very elementary on one level, very scholarly on the other, and everything in between. Okay? And that's the way God wrote it, for people just like you and me and everybody else to read it and get something out of it. So don't be afraid of it.
Don't get scared.
Yeah, don't get scared.
That's the beauty of a Catholic, as opposed to a Protestant, is we have that corrective whenever there are those things that are a little bit of doubt,
Yes.
things like the perpetual virginity of Mary or something. In a Protestant Bible group, people will argue about that kind of thing, whereas we can go to church teaching about how to interpret that, and so those things.
That's right.
It really helps us.
We can argue too, and you'll get that in Catholic meetings. Because somebody will stand up and say, hey, all right, let's stop this. Let's go ask something. We have that recourse at least.
Yeah.
At least it's available for us. I feel sorry for the people that don't have it available for them. And that's where all the confusion comes. Yes, sir.
Well, when you talk about the people that are always trying to interpret the Bible and put their liberal slant on it, I thought that was pretty much in Vatican II when I heard that when all the presentations were made, that the liberals tried to get through their ideas, but they wouldn't sell. So what they did, they got together and said, we'll get with the regular people and we'll see if we can agree with them, but we'll change the wording so that we can pick up on the wording later on. Is that about what you're...
Oh yeah, they've admitted that. Many years after the council took place, they've admitted that they actually put phrases in the documents so that they could use them later on. They put ambiguous phrases in those documents that were not false in themselves, you see. So you can't blame the Holy Spirit and say, well, he gave us something false.
Yeah.
And they knew that, you see. But they also admitted that. Sheila Bakes admitted that.
Oh, he was a dandy.
Yeah, he was a dandy. Kung admitted that, Hans Kung admitted that, they did all get together. So there was an agenda there, okay? And that's diabolical. That is really diabolical
They were the darling of the press for a while, Schillebeck and Kung. And now all of a sudden you find out you haven't heard them for years. They disappeared.
Yeah.
They got wiped out.
Right, and the damage that they've done persists.
Yes.
So, and that's usually what happens.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
If you could take a whole book and put it in a small pamphlet, and then contrary to previous requests, keep it real simple, can you explain the controversy with your comments against the Jewish writer, or whoever this Roy or Ray or whatever his name was? What was going on there for people who are challenging your appearance here?
Oh, okay, well. I have a beef with his book. It's called Salvation is from the Jews. Okay, and my basic contention with that book is that it is viewing the Jewish people as if they're still the chosen people of God. And because of that mentality that he has, his book conveys the idea that the Jews are still a special people in the eyes of God, above Gentile converts, that the Jews, as a race of people, and he says this verbatim in his book, as a race of people are blessed by nature, just because they're Jews, are blessed, and because of that blessing, God's going to do tremendous things with them now and in the future that he's not going to do with us Gentile converts. And I object to that because according to the New Testament and traditional church teaching, there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile any longer, because we're all one in Christ. And any kind of hint that one race is better than another, is just not Christianity. It's just not based on race. It's based on the fact that we're all brothers in Christ. We're all spiritual brothers, and nobody's better than anybody else. And that's my contention with that. Now, there's some people that interpret my criticism of that as being like I'm against the Jewish people. I'm not against the Jewish people. Yeah, well, that's sort of the propaganda that comes out.
But there's another argument on that point. I read about 800 years ago or something. They're getting back to the point where most of the Jews today are not Sephardic Jews. They're the Ashkenazi. They came from the East that picked up a religion, and they picked up the Jewish traditions and joined the Jewish faith. But they're not the blood descendants of, and I've heard other Jews argue this thing over, that they got kind of upset about anybody claiming to know the Jewish tradition and so forth, when they're not the Sephardic Jews, but the Ashkenazi from way East Russia. Have you heard anything on that?
Yeah, there's always a debate going on, who's got the legitimacy. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that someone's claiming, whether it's Sephardic, Ashkenazi, or anything in between, that the Jewish race is a superior Christian denomination, so to speak.
The argument themselves about that's what I mean. So that they can't even agree with themselves on that point.
Yeah. Now, the New Testament does say that God will preserve the Jewish race per se, okay, until the end of time. So that debate, I think, to me, has already been settled because we have divine revelation that whoever is identified as a Jew, we know in fact that there are some of them existing today. Okay, so whether it's Sephardic or Ashkenazi doesn't really matter to me. The fact that we have Jews today, according to the Word of God, means that that's sufficient enough to build our understanding and our case.
Well, I don't care as long as we get a suit at the right price, Minister. I don't care.
That's a good way to say it. Yes, sir.
There's two questions. One, a definition of Magisterium.
Magisterium. Okay.
And also, on this topic here, the Jews don't recognize Jesus Christ as the Messiah, so that really puts them on the outside, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. This issue here is dealing with the Jewish convert to the faith, but then the other side is the Jews themselves. And this gets into the whole idea of political Zionism, the nation-state of Israel, because a lot of our Protestant Christians believe from the dispensational camps that You know, the Jews are the blessed race, and that God is behind the Israeli army, and it's God's purpose to use the Israeli army to take over the whole Middle East, and Jesus is going to come back from heaven and reign in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, you know, and all kinds of national and ethnic ties like that are infiltrating the spiritual understanding of the New Testament, you see, and that's what I'm really combating, is this attempt to put a ethnic or national interpretation on these spiritual passages in the New Testament. That's what I'm really fighting. So whether it's Jewish converts or Jews that haven't converted or national Jews or Zionists or whatever it is, that's what I'm fighting, is their attempt to seize the New Testament from us and interpret it in a nationalistic or ethnic sense. It's not to be done that way, and we've never done it that way in our tradition. If anything, we've made a sharp distinction between those two, and have told the ethnic national party to leave the Bible alone, basically.
And the definition of magisterium?
Magisterium, the definition of magisterium, that comes from the Latin word magister, which means ruler. Okay. In other words, the magisterium is the authority, the final authority for what is true or false, and that's what Jesus gave to Peter in Matthew 16. Whatever you bind shall be bound, whatever you loose shall be loosed. That's the magisterium. And that would include the Pope and his bishops. Okay? But the Pope being the supreme. He can overrule any bishop at any time. Even the College of Bishops, he can overrule them as well. Okay, I've got a lot of hands up, but I'll have to go to my sponsor back there first.
Back up what Bob's saying here, because I don't know how many of you, well, a lot of you probably saw this many years ago. It came out about 25, 30 years ago, a movie called The Cardinal. And it was supposed to portray the growth of a priest all the way to getting his beret or whatever.
Wasn't that the guy who played Superman? Didn't he play that part? Yeah.
Yes. And there was a lot of hidden propaganda in this movie. But with all due respect to my good Irish friends who are like heralds, that one of the lines in the movie was, well, I see God was an Irishman. Because the Irish took on this genre that they were better Catholics than somebody else in a lot of cases. And the point here that he's trying to make is that directly from St. Paul is, yes, we are all equal in Christ Jesus. There are no Jews, Gentiles, man or woman, what slave or free.
Yeah, you get a lot of that today. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Cardinal Keeler wrote a document called Reflections on Covenant and Mission in 2002 with Jewish rabbis. And one of the most alarming statements in that document says that the Jews have their own covenant with God, and it's not necessary for them to convert to Christianity. And this is from a cardinal in the Catholic Church, one of the highest cardinals in the Catholic Church.
But that's not real, is it, though?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, he had to backtrack because so many people complained about it. But he's not the only one. There's all kinds of cardinals in the Catholic Church. Cardinal Casper from Vienna, same thing. Cardinal Willebrands. And the sad part about this is that each of them have been appointed to official positions in relations with the Jews and Protestant denominations. You know, so it's
isn't that the smoke in the church?
Yeah, that's the smoke. Yeah, that's pretty smoky, I would say. Yeah.
I have a question.
Okay, let's get somebody who hasn't asked first. So, yes, sir.
I hope it's me. In relation to the Virgin Mary, our devotion to the Virgin Mary as Catholics, you know, every time that you talk to Protestants, they always say, there's nothing in the Bible about the Virgin Mary. And one of the things that I have several friends that are always saying, the Virgin Mary, you guys are always saying that the Virgin Mary was forever virgin, that she was never with a man. He says, but she had other sons after Jesus Christ. And so that, you know, makes it that she wasn't forever virgin. Also on the rosary with in the Bible, they said there's nothing in the Bible that talks about the rosary. I have several questions that I could probably go on and on asking you, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The first thing you would say to a Protestant is, where does the Bible say it's the only authority on these issues? Okay, then you're going to get into a whole other discussion with him. You're going to put him, you know, you're going to make him feel a little nervous now, because now he's got to prove one point in order to condemn the point that you brought up. Okay, but he's not going to be able to. That's number one. Where does the Bible say that it's the only authority on this issue of Mary and the Rosary? Okay? All right, that may take a couple of weeks for him to figure out. Okay? So at least you put him off. But then you can be kind to him and say, well, while you're thinking about that answer, okay, let me tell you this. All right? And so you can go, and then you can deal with this issue about Mary and the brothers and sisters of Jesus. Okay? Now, I don't mean to put a plug in for my book necessarily, but I have about 20 pages on that issue in the Gospel of Matthew, because that's the one gospel that mentions it the most, about these brothers and sisters of Jesus, in about 3 different places. Okay? So if you want to know all the ins and outs of it, I can't cover all those details right now because it's going to get us a little astray. Okay? But it's in there for you. Okay? That's exactly why I made that Bible. So exactly for questions just like this, the very questions that these Protestants always ask and always assume that they know the answers to, when they really don't, because they've never really studied. All they've done is regurgitate the same information that's been given them by somebody else, you know, who's in their church. Okay? They've never studied it for themselves. They just see the word brother or sister there, and they assume that it means the same thing in Greek that it means in English, and it doesn't. It doesn't. Not by any stretch of the imagination. This is where those translations come in. See, we don't have a word that we can use for the Greek word adelphos.
Like I've heard that it says that it means at that time, brothers meant cousins and, you know, relatives.
Yeah, it could mean anything. And the Hebrew ab, the word ab was the same way. You know, it could mean your uncle, it could mean your father, it could mean your brother. I mean, all kinds of. It depends on the context that word was used. That's going to determine what the meaning was.
Just like the black community. Hi, brother.
Yeah, there you go. See, we even use that in English. Yeah, we do. Okay.
Another,
and it's good
if
to
I
put
can
that.
follow up a little bit more. How did it happen that, you know, Jesus Christ was all his life, his 33 years or whatever it was, 33, 34 years that he was with us, it all centered around the Middle East, but yet the Catholic faith, the base of the Catholic Church is in Rome. How did that take place?
Well, Paul went on missionary journeys, and the last place he ended up was in Rome. And St. Peter was actually a bishop in Antioch first, and then he transferred over to Rome. And the fathers of the church write about that. So actually, Peter and Paul did end up in Rome, and they both died there, as a matter of fact. Okay, that's why the bones of Peter
are still in the Vatican.
Yeah, tombed by the Vatican. So that's how it all got started. Paul made 3 missionary journeys, and he eventually got to Rome. He actually wrote the Roman epistle from Philippian jail that he was in, and said he wanted to come there eventually, and he did get there. So that's how it spread out. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yes, sir.
I was going to ask, this has always bothered me. When Jesus sent out the disciples and told them to do this and that, and comb your hair and keep everything straight, don't you? And but here, what could they teach? Because they're telling about the kingdom of God, but I mean, there was a sort of a limbo religion they were teaching, wasn't it? Because Jesus hadn't died on the cross yet. He hadn't instituted the Eucharist. Just what were they going out and preaching, or were they going out and saying, "Oh, don't touch that dial, we're going to be back in a little while and give you the rest of it." Because most of the people that they talked to, evidently, since Jesus was only on earth 3 years, they were alive, they heard that, and then when Jesus died on the cross, is that that they were sowing the seed ahead of time, but they weren't really sowing a Christian, a Catholic religion?
No, the gospel was available right from the beginning of time until it's going to be available until the end of time. Okay, there's just more information that we have. But they could, you know, Jesus talks about the gospel being preached to the Naaman the Syrian back in the Old Testament, or the Queen of Sheba, or the Ninevites. You know, because basically the gospel is one simple message: is repent of your sins and come to God. Okay, that's the gospel message in a nutshell. All right. Then when you can get to the finer details of that, when Jesus died on the cross, that made it all possible.
Yeah.
Okay. But the fact is that the essence of the gospel was available, you know, long before Jesus died on the cross. Jesus only basically confirmed or fulfilled what that gospel message was that was already preached. Okay, and gave us the reasons why it could be why it couldn't be given the gift that it was giving us.
So what they were preaching, what the people heard, was not anything new or surprising to them.
No, I mean, look at John the Baptist. What was his gospel message?
Yeah.
Repent and be baptized. That's it. Okay? It wasn't any long dissertations about the theological implications of the atonement or anything like that at all. They didn't need to hear that stuff. Okay? Well, you know, once the church was established, of course, that was necessary because Jesus had died. Now we need to explain, why did he die? Why did he rise again? What does all that mean? So that became part of the gospel, an additional part of the gospel, you see. But it didn't change the essence of the gospel. The essence of the gospel is repent of your sin and come to God. You see, anybody can understand that.
Yeah, well, I was wondering, they were in a kind of a limbo then, because those people that listened to these disciples, apostles that came to them, those people who listened knew a bit more about what was coming and what was going to happen than people that wouldn't listen to their preaching. So,
sure.
As I say, that there was some advance that was made over what they all had already known, but hadn't reached the point of the crucifixion and the institution of the Eucharist and so forth, and Pentecost, which is the first, the birthday of the church.
Sure.
Really,
you know, like that story we covered last night about Nicodemus. Jesus came to him. He says, "What must I do to get to the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus, "You have to be born of water and the Spirit." And that was it. That's all Jesus really told him. You see. Now, once Nicodemus commits himself and says, "Okay, yeah, I understand. I will do that. I'll submit myself." You know, then he would go through the learning process. You know, and then he needed education now to learn all the ramifications of what he just did, and all the ins and outs of the atonement that Jesus performed on the cross and all that. And that takes time for people to understand. But the basic gospel was, you repent of your sin, Nicodemus, and come into the kingdom of heaven. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
Did you have a question?
Ladies first. Go ahead.
But when were the disciples sent out? Maybe I misunderstood. I thought the disciples actually did not start going out until after the crucifixion and the Holy Spirit came on them.
No, they were sent out long before that. The 70 in Luke 10 were sent out 2 by 2. They came back to Jesus and they said, you know, by the power of your name, we saw demons being cast out of people. We saw this, we saw that.
Okay.
Yeah, they were going on. And Jesus says, I came to the house of the lost sheep of Israel. Okay, and that was his first mission. Before he died on the cross, he was going to basically exclusively preach to the Jews. And that's what he did. And that's why we say that the gospel, or the promises that were given to the fathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were fulfilled when Jesus came, because his direct mission, as he promised Abraham, was to give the gospel of salvation to the Jews. And so he fulfilled everything in the Old Testament.
Okay.
Okay, yes?
Yeah, I understood. In fact, we've done this at my parish in Riverside, where we go out once a week 2 by 2 and go door to door in the canonical territory of the parish. And we were given a catechesis before we started this. We call it traditio, because tradere, to pass on what we've received from the church and the good things God has done in our lives. And the catechesis we were given to prepare us was that Jesus sent out the 70 or 72 and then the 12 prima facie to prepare the soil, as it were, for his own preaching future, and also so that these men themselves would see what God was capable of doing. It was very much for them individually, not just, as Dick was pointing out, you know, what were they going to preach concretely. He said very, very well, I think, if they weren't bringing, you know, elevated atonement theological concepts or something. So what then was the reason? Yes, partly to prepare the soil, as it were, for Christ to come soon thereafter, and maybe even more so, for these men themselves to have a personal experience of the power of God vis-a-vis the kingdom of Christ.
Right, very good, excellent. As a matter of fact, when they came back, they said, you know, in the Greek it says like they were amazed that all these things were happening, you know, that they could actually cast out demons. And remember what Jesus says to them in return?
He said, "Behold, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven."
That's right. Yeah, and he says, but don't be amazed at that. Be amazed that your names are written in the kingdom of heaven. You know, that you are privileged to do this. You know, so as you guys are going out 2 by 2, you know, that's considered a privilege.
It is. And I'll just say one thing that I've experienced. I haven't seen, you know, visions or anything like that. Thank God. But as far as demons being cast out, well, as far as demons being cast out, we've been to the door and fallen away Catholics, or at one time we went and the man all but told us, because the two of you came tonight, you prevented me from physically striking my wife. Because he was a Catholic man and he was in a very disordered state when we knocked on the door on Thursday night. And I think I understand now better what Christ meant when he said, you know, demons, you'll drink the poison of vipers and all that. There's more than one type of poison, and the demons don't generally come with horns and a tail and fangs.
Very good. Thank you. Yes, yes, ma'am.
I was just going to
I'll
say,
get you next, ma'am.
regarding that comment about the apostles going out before Christ died, well, St. Paul went after Christ died. So he could preach about death on Jesus dying on the cross for us, couldn't he?
Yes, certainly.
So it got over there through him.
Yes.
And followers.
And the formula that was followed by the apostles was what Jesus laid down in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, which is, you should go out and preach the gospel to Jerusalem, Judea. Now Judea was the county or the country surrounding Jerusalem, to Samaria, which was further north of Judea, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. So it was a progression of 4 steps, basically. First in Jerusalem, and that's where the first council was held, and that's where the first converts to Christianity were made. They were all Jews, you see. And then it went out to those Gentile areas, and Paul was part of that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, two-part question. Is the placing of the altar facing the east a sacred tradition? And if so, can that, or if not, what can be used as a fundamental argument to have the altar turn to facing the east? And could you give a little background as to why it faces the east?
Well,
good question.
Because that's where the center of worship was, you know, in Jerusalem. So, I mean, that's why it faces east, and that's the tradition that's been passed down to us, you know. And again, you know, if someone's going to change that, my argument to them is the burden of proof is on you to change that, you know. And first of all, change is not good just for the sake of change, number one. And you have to have proof in order to change what you're changing. You have to have strong evidence to do it. Otherwise, you upset the faith of the people, you know. So, and the faith of the people is sometimes precarious enough as it is, you know, because they live in this very evil world. Things bombarding them from all over the place from the outside. So why are you even thinking about upsetting something inside the church that's going to make them, you know, lose faith in their church and wonder why all these changes are? See, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction in physical law. Okay, and the same thing is true in the church. For every action you do, there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction, especially for the people in the church. You see, so that I basically say they have no rationale in order to do that. There's no reason to change that. The only times the church really needs to change is if something detrimental is happening inside the church, something bad is happening that needs to be eradicated and immediately, and that calls for real radical change. But that doesn't happen that often in the church, you see, because you know, people know what's good and bad, and they know how to live their lives. It comes naturally to them. They know. Anytime something bad happens, if somebody evil gets in the church and upsets it, then the church has to deal with it. And most of our dogmas were made during those very times. You know, when somebody evil got in the church and started asking, you know, all the wrong questions and started to upset people's faith and challenging previous doctrines, and then the church came down and said, no, this is the way it's going to be, you see. So, does that answer your question?
Well, so you're saying it is a sacred tradition, and therefore that can be used as the basis, say, for an argument to have the altar return to its original.
Well, when you use the adjective sacred in front of tradition, okay, you know, that's a debatable point. What is sacred tradition? Is that different than tradition?
That's
okay?
another question.
Yeah. Well, the only sacred tradition that the Catholic Church knows about is what they call apostolic tradition. If someone can prove that the tradition we follow comes from the apostles, then we would call it sacred tradition, and it would be infallible. Okay. The question is proving that. There's only a certain few ways you can prove that. One of those is by the consensus of the fathers. And we say, if the fathers had a consensus on a various point, as a matter of fact, they do have one on this issue here, because they all face the east, then we know that the apostles taught the same thing. The fathers are in consensus, and there's no disagreement among them. Okay? That's how we call it sacred tradition. All right? So, now I don't know all the details of this. I'd have to do some more research on it, but as far as I know, that was our sacred tradition. Okay? Yeah.
I'd just like to recommend The Spirit of the Liturgy by Cardinal Ratzinger. He has a chapter on liturgical direction, and he talks about why the foundation or their argument to change the direction of the liturgy came from some anomalies in some old church structures in Europe, where the altar would face the people, but the church was built towards the west, so he would face the people, but then the people would turn around to face the east during the consecration, so that the priest who would be behind them would actually be facing their backs.
Yeah.
So it's still the tradition of facing the east, but specifically, the most important thing is the consecration itself. I don't know why they built it towards the west at that time.
It's typical of how they distort things, because if you don't know that particular background to why they changed it around, then you go off on some tangent.
I think I read some recent commentary on this, that if there's going to be some sort of compromise in the new Ordo, it's going to be something like facing the people during the majority of the Mass, but at the consecration, the priest would go on the other side and face east.
Yeah, don't hold your breath.
So we don't have to.
Bob? Yeah, that was my follow-up to her question. If I'm reading the news correctly, coming from the Vatican, that the Holy Father and Cardinal Erroneous, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, have tried to tell the bishops in the various countries that to be faithful to the original canon of the Latin, that it be translated correctly. Said, for example, in the Acts of Consecration of the Precious Blood, instead of saying, and for all, it's going to go back to et pro multis, for the many, but also Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo, and say, and with your spirit. Is that coming back, or the American church is slow to react to these things always?
Dominus vobiscum? Are you saying, is that coming back?
Well, the actual words where the Lord be with you and with your spirit.
Oh, I don't know. I
Instead
haven't
of
heard that.
and with you.
Yeah.
I heard that all these are going to, within 2 years, are supposed to be adopted again by the bishops to follow correctly the translation from the Latin to the English or the French or whatever language, the Spanish, whatever language you happen to speak in.
Yeah. Well, that would be good. I think I did hear something along those lines. I didn't know if it was definitive or not.
That was the subject of the last bishops' conference last year, and they voted to approve the "and with thy spirit," and also, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest enter under my roof, but only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. That will be returned from the Scriptures. That comes from the Scriptures directly, not what we're actually saying today. So.
Good, excellent. Sounds good.
Dr. Sungenis, would you expound on the tremendous evil that is hidden in the theory of evolution, how that has affected in many ways and weakened our belief?
Yeah, well, the basic way that it does so is it takes our trust in the Bible and throws it to the wind, because the theory of evolution and the biblical account, if you're going to interpret it literally, are at odds. They're at total odds. So that's number one. You either accept the Bible, and it's day by day literal rendition of what happened during the creation, or you accept evolution. Now there's been various ways that various Catholics have tried to accommodate both views. And the first way that was propounded was the day-age theory, where each day of Genesis was millions of years, and then that fell out of favor because they figured out that if the plants are created on the third day and the sun's created on the fourth day, well, that doesn't leave too many. That leaves a little bit too much room for photosynthesis to occur, right? So that theory was abandoned after a few years, and then another theory that came along was Now, what we didn't have to assign millions of years to the days of Genesis because they weren't literal anymore. And the fathers of the church all interpreted them literally. The only deviation from that was St. Augustine, but he didn't believe in anything near to evolution. He just suggested, based on his understanding of Sirach 18:1, that the days of Genesis were all one day. That God created everything instantaneously. Okay? And that was the only deviation from what the other fathers had said, that it was 6 literal 24-hour days. All right? So we have a consensus of the fathers on that issue. The popes follow along, the medievals follow along. Everything was fine until Darwin and Lyell came up with their theory in the 1800s. Okay? And so people had to make a decision now, because it looked like what Lyell was saying about these layers being formed on the earth over millions of years, it looked like that was true. Okay? Because you would figure, as you know, you're pouring stuff on the earth, so to speak, and layers are forming. It takes time to do that. Okay? And he just assigned millions of years to those layers. And we didn't have any contrary evidence to that, like we have today. So it was a matter of choosing between science and the Bible. Now, what we've learned, and we have to thank the Protestants for this, actually, because they were the ones to really stick their necks out. The Catholics weren't doing it too much. As a matter of fact, most of the Catholics were trying to side with evolution. And the Protestants came along and did some scientific investigation into these very issues, and found that the science was actually supporting the creation model much better than it was supporting the evolution model. But we didn't know that prior to, say, 1950 or so. Okay? That's when all the scientific evidence started to come out. And then some very conservative Catholics also got on that same boat, and they did their own scientific investigations too, and they were finding the same results. Okay? So finally, but you don't hear about that too much in Catholic circles, that there are Catholics actually doing those kinds of things. But the Protestants have made a big thing about it. There's very well-endowed institutions across the United States that do this very kind of work. Christian Research Institute, Answers in Genesis. There's another institute in California. They're all in California, as a matter of fact. They've done a tremendous amount of work using science to support the biblical record. And it's amazing what you find out. I don't know, you want me to go on further with that, or?
Well, I'm concerned that it's not discussed much in my hearing, or the Catholic press doesn't address it very often or in any depth. And it's a giant hoax, with the purpose of which is to undercut our faith in God. And so it goes along, taught in all of our schools, at the university level, the grade school level. It's taught as fact, and it's fiction.
Yeah.
And this can be known, but the falsity of it is not being addressed, in my view, strongly enough within the Catholic Church and the Catholic circles.
Yeah, because there's a movement in Catholicism right now to try to, the ecumenical movement, so to speak. And this is not only an ecumenical movement among the religions of the world, it's also among the relationship between religion and science. That's sort of an unwritten rule, okay? And so you have a lot of Catholic cardinals bending over backwards to accommodate the evolutionary theory. And, theistic evolution is one of those. As a matter of fact, Cardinal Schönborn from Vienna, he's come out and criticized evolution in the last couple of years with some very terse statements. But the other side of that, of course, is that he believes in theistic evolution. All he's saying basically is that, well, you can't believe in secular evolution because there's no God behind it. But you can believe in evolution as long as you believe that there's a God behind it making this mechanism work. Because, he says, secular evolution doesn't have any mechanism to make it work. Okay? So it's a theory that's a hoax, basically. And so you put God behind it as if God's going to put some pixie dust on it and make it all work. And so they're satisfied. And that's as far as the discussion has gone in Catholic circles, at least in the major Catholic circles. It stops at theistic evolution. Okay? And but I'm a member of an organization, the Colby Center for the Study of Creation. We have scientists from all over the world, and theologians from all over the world, about 30 of us. And we go the next step. We say, look, evolution itself is a bogus theory. Okay? Putting God behind it and saying God's going to make it work is not going to patch it up. Okay? Let's go to the next step. Let's return to the biblical account of creation, and let's see if we can get science to agree with that. Can we do that? Yeah, we can do that. First we can eradicate Lyell's understanding of the formation of these layers over millions of years. We can show scientifically that they can be formed almost instantaneously. Once you knock that pillar out of the evolutionary foundation, everything else is downhill basically, because mutations aren't going to work to perform the changes that they need, and that's basically what they go by, is genetic mutations. We can disprove that scientifically very easily. Genetic mutations do not make beneficial changes. If anything, they make bad changes. So that's it. We knocked another plank out of their scientific theory. See, so that's what we can do today. But it's a hard struggle, because there is a diabolical disorientation out there, as Sister Lucy said to us. And people are blinded by this, not only evolution, but a lot of other scientific theories are blinded by, because science is the God today. And in one of my other books, I write about this. I show all the documentation for why science is regarded as a God today, in the place of religion, you see. And that's where the controversy lies. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask a question, and I used to teach confirmation, and when my kids would ask me about that, I'm very simplistic, but I would tell them, I will begin to accept evolution maybe when they find the missing link. They still haven't solved that basic missing link. But anyway, the question I wanted to pose to you was, I heard, and I wanted to see what you think about that, because it makes sense to me and my beliefs. Just as Adam was created as an adult, he wasn't created as a baby and had to grow his teeth and go through puberty and all of that. He was created as a man. Why couldn't God do that to the earth, where he created it to look as if millions of years had gone by for all of these things to happen, but they happened instantaneously, the same way as Adam had his full head of hair, his full teeth, everything that now takes us 20 years to get. Our wisdom teeth don't come in till we're, 18, 17? And yet, when God created Adam, it looked like Adam went through all that, but he was instantaneously created an adult. Why couldn't God do that with the earth? Now, I don't know.
But are you saying that God could create it instantaneously, but make it look like it was millions of years? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, well, see, that's where they would have to prove that, though. Because if the prima facie evidence shows that it was instantaneous, then why would you go to the other solution that says, well, it actually was here for millions of years? Okay? So what I'm trying to say here is that the so-called looking like it's millions of years is a myth in itself. It doesn't look like millions of years if you use the proper scientific basis to come to analyze it. You see? I would agree that there's two theories. One theory is, that the layers could form over millions of years. There's another theory that they can form instantaneously. Okay, well, which one agrees with the biblical record? Well, it's certainly not the one that's over millions of years, you see. So that's where we're going with that. And you also mentioned the fossil evidence, or the missing link evidence. This is the third plank that we've got them on. And they've admitted this themselves. In other words, to go from a fish to a reptile, you have to have intermediate steps, right? You have to have a fish growing limbs, and change its body structure somehow to more look like a reptile, right? Okay, you would figure that. If there's going to be evolution, we should see some of these intermediate forms between a fish and a reptile, correct? Or a fish and an amphibian. We should see those different forms. They should be in the fossil record. Well, what do we find in the fossil record? We find fish, and we find amphibians, and we find reptiles, but we don't find anything in between. Okay? Not one have they found that they can honestly say this is an intermediate form that proves evolution. As a matter of fact, the two leading evolutionists in the world in 1982, Stephen Gould, who just died recently, from Harvard, and Niles Eldredge from England, who's the curator for the American Museum for Paleontology, they have admitted in 1982 at a big conference they had in Chicago, with all these scientists there, They say, look, we can't find any intermediate forms. As a matter of fact, Niles Eldridge, this other evolutionist who was with Gould, would go out on expeditions at least twice, 3 times a year to go look for fossils in various parts of the world. And he would come back frustrated every time. Not fossils, intermediate fossils, to try to find a link between the fish and the amphibian. Couldn't find any, okay? And he would turn over hundreds and hundreds of tons of dirt to look for it. Can't find it. So they finally came to this meeting and they said, look, we can't find any of these intermediate fossils. What are we going to do? Here's what we suggest. We will suggest a new theory called punctuated equilibrium. And that's just a fancy word for saying that they didn't appear in steps. They just came on the earth suddenly. So that's why we have the fish, they came suddenly. That's why we have the amphibians, they came suddenly. You've heard about this theory? Okay. And, and so on and so on. They all came suddenly. And the reason we don't see any intermediate forms is because there wasn't enough time to form them, because all these species were, eradicated. Okay? So here's a total rejection of, well, and what we need to know also is that Darwin himself, when he formulated the evolutionary theory in 1859, said in his very book, Origin of the Species, if they can't find any intermediate forms, if there's no evidence between a fish and an amphibian, or an amphibian and a reptile, then evolution is false. Darwin said that himself. Okay? So here these guys are in 1982.
They don't put that in the textbooks.
No, they don't. 130 years later, they are fulfilling Darwin's words, which is, we can't find any intermediate fossils. So what do? They change the theory. They change the evolutionary theory to something different, you see. And that's what's happened all the time, okay? So we see it's a bunch of chicanery, okay? There's just guys that have an agenda. It's a religion to them. They're going to do anything they can to preserve that religion, okay? And they're going to avoid the scientific evidence. They're going to interpret it differently than what you would normally interpret it as, you see. Naturally, if there's no intermediate fossils, what's the conclusion? There's no evolution, okay? But you can change the theory. Okay, I got to get this man back here. He said ask a question. Yes. You.
Yeah, I want to get back to something more basic. Is there, from the Vatican or the Magisterium, how much control or lack of control do they have in the Mass? We used to have an international Mass. You go every place and the Mass is the same. Yeah. Now you go all over the country and you don't know what to do when you walk in a church. You stand all the time, you sit, you kneel. Do they give them free rein on how to run the Mass?
Well, no. It's you have to understand that there's a strained relationship between the Pope and the bishops these days that wasn't there prior to Vatican II. There's a lot more what they call collegiality among the bishops, wherein they think that they can make their own independent decisions to a certain degree, independent of the Vatican. And that's what you're seeing today in the United States. Some people say that there's a virtual schism between the bishops in the United States and the Vatican. I don't know, if that's all true or not, okay? I know that when the Vatican makes a definitive decision, these bishops will fall in line, okay? I know that for a fact. But all those other areas where there's maybe a lot of freedom for them to maneuver and to assert their authority, well, that's what they've done, okay? So it's not the same as it was back in the Latin traditional Mass days, where everyone marched to the tune of what the Vatican was saying without question, okay? The days are different today, and that's why we have this confusion. Okay, yes, ma'am.
I always question this. I always question people's hearts. Is it that our bishops truly, the American bishops truly believe that what they're doing is for the good of the people? Or, I just question these things. These things are serious. These changes are serious. You're talking about people's faith and their salvation. And the people don't know what to do a lot, because you go to your church and you're told this, and the bishop endorses it, and you think you're going on the right road. And I know if you're truly trying, you know, you're not going to be held at fault. But it's really hard. I don't know what you would suggest. Because people, you know, even in our own diocese, you go to some things at the diocese, and, you know, I know a lot of times out of the Los Angeles Education Conference, there's some willy-nilly stuff coming out of there. And a lot of people that have come back from those conferences, I've heard them say, well, you know, Adam and Eve, it was all make-believe, and it's not really true. And so what do you suggest? You know, I mean, people, this is serious. This is our faith, and this is our salvation that's on the line.
Yeah.
Mother,
I think
how much should we listen to and obey?
Yeah, well, you do have to put yourself under the authority of the Magisterium, and you are in the authority of your bishop, whether he's good, bad, or indifferent. And, you know, the prerogatives we have are to voice our opinion. Canon law says we have the right to voice our opinion to the pastors of the church and to all the Christian faithful. Canon 2:12 says that. So, but that's where our prerogatives end. See, because we have no authority. All right. So if that's the case, well, we can write as many letters as we want to them and to the Vatican, and I've done that myself. We can have places like this where we can commune and talk to the Christian faithful, as canon law says we can do. We can go march on the steps of the bishop's office if we need to. We can do that. We can carry placards if we want to, down with the bishop or something. I don't know. You know, there are a lot of ways we can do that. Okay, but but we do have to remember, as Catholics, if we start bucking the authority to the point where we become the authority, then we're Protestants. Okay, and we can't do that.
Right.
Okay, you know, two wrongs don't make a right. I think the major reason why all this has occurred is that these new liberal ideas, and the bishops that carry them, the priests that carry them, is this idea that there's something wrong with the Catholic faith. Okay, that we don't have all the answers, and the Protestants have a lot more answers, and we should be listening to them.
Well, they should leave and go be a Protestant.
Yeah, but see, the problem with that is the bishops have interpreted ecumenism to such a point where now we're melding Protestantism and Catholicism together and making a new hybrid religion is basically what's happening, you see. And in order for us to preserve, you know, our Catholic religion, we do have to have a separation from them to a very large degree. We can talk to them, you know, there's nothing wrong with talking to them, but we have to keep separate from them. That's what God told the Israelites. Yeah, you can talk to these foreign nations, but you remain separate from them, you see. And as soon as you start melding those things together, you get all kinds of newfangled ideas in there, and that's basically what's happening. That's where all these innovations to the mass come from. They come from Protestants.
Exactly.
You know, and all the innovations we've had to Scripture study have all come from Protestants. That's why I stressed that last night. That lady that was there last night got upset with me. She says I was disdaining Protestants. I wasn't disdaining Protestants. I'm just trying to show that, hey, we're the Catholic Church. We're the ones with the truth. We should be teaching them what the truth is, not them teaching us what the truth is.
Just again, to validate what he's just saying, I don't know about your parishes, but during Lent, our hymns this Lent, instead of Lord who throughout these 40 days, or Sacred Head Surrounded, typical Lenten devotional song, we're singing Abide With Me and Softly and Tenderly. Now that's fine when I was a Southern Baptist. Those are not Catholic hymns. That's what we're getting fed in our parishes. As that came from this conference in LA that she's talking about.
So that's the problem. You know,
expanding a little bit more about what all those people are saying, is that one of the things that is driving a lot of Catholics out of the Catholic Church and going to the Protestant churches?
No, I don't think it's that so much. No, I think it's the Protestants who have actually said that, you know, forget this ecumenism stuff. We're Protestants, and we're going to steal your sheep.
Yep.
That's where it's all coming from.
Because they have a knack of getting into the weaknesses of the people that don't grasp everything that the Catholic faith
Yes,
is teaching us,
but-
and they have this ability to really get into our weaknesses
Sure.
and draw our people
Yeah,
away
but
from our
what I'm
church.
saying is that comes from Protestants who don't believe in ecumenism with the Catholic Church. They believe in Protestantism, and they want to make Catholics Protestants and remain separate from us, you see. All right? So we have two problems, basically.
I just
Yeah.
want to say
Can I
one
bring
thing.
up the subject that we brought up before?
Let this lady, she has
No,
to
I
ask
just
a
want to
question.
say one thing about the footnotes. You know,
The footnotes in the
some of
NAB
the
Bible?
books they have out, the religious education books for children, everything in the Old Testament is a myth.
Yeah.
And I brought this up to my DRE because I would not let my children have this book. Because once you say myth to a child, especially a 7th grader, they're going to think everything is a myth.
Right.
And we were still told to use the same book.
And that's what they want to do. They want to plant that seed in you, in your mind,
Right.
that what you're reading may not be true.
So we didn't
So they
use the
pick
book.
a-
I took out of the book what I knew was Catholic doctrine, and they never saw that book because it was wrong. And all I got was a form letter from the bishop saying that, thank you for bringing it to my attention, but, you know? So this is where it's starting. It's starting with our youth.
Yeah.
And they're our future, and they're gonna get fed this, you know, in the 7th, 8th, 9th grade. They're so impressionable.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are gonna be leading the church. They're gonna go to the Baptist church down the street.
And the next step, of course, is to start attacking the religious content. And they've actually, Raymond Brown already did do that. He said religious content is also not infallible or inerrant in the Bible, okay? And so the next step, of course, is to question the veracity of the Gospels themselves when they talk about salvation. Who knows where it's all going to end? And we're in a big battle. It's a big battle, and it's not going to end until Jesus comes.
But we will prevail.
We will prevail.
Amen.
Jesus, St. Paul talks about the remnant of Israel. I talked about this last night. There were, 3, 4, 5 million people in national Israel in the 8th, 9th century BC. And how many could he find that were faithful to the faith? 7,000. That's 0.013%. I mean, that's really small. Okay, so be prepared, folks. I don't think it's going to get too much better. Yes?
Just to bring it up real quickly, I was surprised that more people hadn't seen this, but I think it was in the last 2 months, it was on spiritdaily.com, a writing where it was quite lengthy and using words that I don't have heard before. This the scientist on evolution, what he did was he was digging in, I think, the genome process, and finding out the complications of this, the spires, with all the various, A, B, D, E, something, components of the way it reads and everything.
The DNA you're talking about?
He had this and other things mixed in, so as I say, he got kind of above my head, but one of the things we pointed out, and he made no argument about it, that he said, this thing is so complicated, so complex, and he went into where, in order for this to form, just like accidentally in
by chance?
Yeah, right. It would take a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a trillion times a trillion. He says there's no way that evolution can back up their stuff. And a few days later, it said that man's word, because he's so highly respected, got around, and when they read these arguments, they said they know of 300 or 600 evolutionists that bailed out of evolution.
Yeah.
Because, did you hear about that?
Yeah, I did hear about that, yeah.
So-
That's happening more frequently than before.
So it's, I guess, so is it.
But you'll find that it's only on Spirit Daily. It's not in the Washington Post. When that happens, it's just mum is the word. Okay, but it does happen. Yeah, Steve.
I was going to ask the doctor. This might seem a bit esoteric, and I don't know whether there's a segue into evolution or anything. But this is something of a question that's been on my mind for a few years, and I've never researched it. Maybe you could say what the church has to say regarding how God arranged the initial population of the earth, because of course, we believe, all here at least, that Adam and Eve were real and created individually, directly by God, etc. That is fine, but how the scripture seems to be silent about how the initial breadth of population developed. Was there something ancestral that at that moment was acceptable, or did God create maybe a tradition outside of Scripture, the fathers or someone propose like an alternate line of creation, that God created other humans directly and mingled?
Good question.
No, the fathers held to the fact that Adam and Eve were only and first parents, and that all the progeny we have after them was interbreeding of Adam's family. In Genesis 4 it says, Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. They may have had dozens of other sons and daughters. We don't know what the
Probably
is.
Irish.
Okay. What's that?
Probably Irish.
Probably Irish. No, they were Italian, actually. So there's Cain, Abel, and Seth we know about, but there are many others. Okay, and it wasn't incest at that time. At that point in time, the only reason today that we have problem with producing children from brothers and sisters, maybe, is because the genetic the genetic basis or the genetic information has been so destroyed. I mean, so altered, where diseases come in and all kinds of things. But that wasn't the case back then. I mean, men were living for 900 years or so before the flood, and the flood changed a lot of the climate and let in a lot of things that weren't there before. That's why they could live so long then. So if there was any problem with interbreeding, they would have been taken care of by the inherent ability of that body to take care of those things at that point in time. But as time progressed, things got slowly worse, and until today, we only live to 70 to 80 years according to the Psalms. And that's because we don't have the ability to fight those things any longer as we did before. So to answer your question is no, nobody else held that idea that there was a separate line that God created.
Maybe 5 more questions.
Okay. How many more questions?
5 or 6.
5 or 6.
So we're just about at 12 o'clock.
I want to get this lady over here. You got a question, ma'am?
No, I've forgotten.
If you remember, let me know.
I mentioned a small revenue. In today's Press Enterprise front page article about our bishop, they gave a breakdown of the population of Catholics in this diocese. We have 1.2 million Catholics, but 250,000 attend church. So you see what our remnant is?
Yeah. Well, that's about par for the course.
75% are out.
Yeah, there's 65 million plus Catholics in the United States. Probably 15 million of them attend Mass on Sunday. Any given day. So, let me get
mine's like to piggyback on her question, but when I was in confirmation class, we had a class of 40 people. I'm lucky if I see maybe 3 people at the same church that did maybe 10 years later. This could be applied to just about almost everybody else at church too. You don't see the young adults. What, in your opinion, what should the church do to encourage more young adult participation in church?
Well, like Hosea 6 says, my people were destroyed for lack of knowledge.
Yes.
And if they're not being catechized by the priests and the bishops, that's where the problem lies. You got to get them when they're young. That's the way I was raised when I was a Catholic, and it hasn't left me. That's the solution to it.
It did for a while, didn't it?
Like I said, I went through Egypt.
I went through Ireland.
Back to the authority of the church and the bishops. When the Pope sends out a direction on how the liturgy will be performed, and the bishops don't go along with it, do they have that authority? Don't the priests have to also obey the Pope?
Oh yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, the Vatican recently came down, with the pro multis issue, the formality issue. The Vatican, listened to all the arguments or whatever and said, no, this is the way it's going to be, and the bishops have to fall in line with that.
They do.
They will fall in line with that. Yeah. When the Vatican makes a definitive statement, and I believe they should do this more often. You see, what's happened is that the Vatican is scared of a schism. They're scared that if they come down too hard and are too definitive about these things, that these bishops are just going to pack up and leave and make another church. That could happen because it's happened in the past. Okay? So there's this sort of balancing act that they have to maintain. On the one hand, somebody will come out with a good statement. On the other hand, they refrain from making those statements.
Well, when the Pope came out with I can't think of the name of it, RS, the recent thing on the liturgy, and it says not optional.
Right.
Not optional.
Yes.
And then the priest says, well, I have to obey my bishop. Well, does he? I mean.
Well, that's just politics there,
Yeah.
That can be dealt with, but to answer your main question is, they are both obligated to obey what the Vatican has said, yeah. But you'll get a lot of people trying to circumvent that, a lot of bishops and priests circumvent that. Yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Now, the problem for them is they all have to band together. Either they speak as one, or they don't speak at all, you see. And that's, that's where you get this problem that may come in, where if they do all band together, they could split from the church.
Yeah.
And then that could be a big problem. And then John Paul II, that was the foremost thing on his mind during this whole 26-year pontificate was, I don't want to come down too hard because we're at such a breaking point right now in the 80s and the early 90s that they could go into schism, you see. And that, so, that guided a lot of his thinking. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to say something else, but that makes me think that I heard that Pope John Paul II did not even want girls to be altar servers.
Yes.
And in America, they had started it already without permission, so he made it okay, so there wouldn't be this problem in America.
Yeah, right. And America was the biggest thing on his mind. It's just one of those prudential decisions he made, good, bad, or indifferent. I wouldn't have done it if I was there, of course, but he made it because he felt that he was preserving the status quo and didn't want to upset it. God will be his judge for that. I can't say anything, but that you're right. They put tremendous pressure on him. They just would not let it go because they knew this was the door. If they could get the women on the altar, then it was just open game now.
Yeah, we're all right.
The mass we went to today, this morning. We have to make sure we sit on the right side of the church so we don't have to take communion from the woman on the left side.
Oh boy, I go through that all the time. I'm probably one of the only, I will not receive communion except from the priest.
Yeah.
I don't know if the priests still hold their fingers like that, but I still believe in those their fingers were consecrated, and so they can touch the Blessed Sacrament.
Yeah, and where do we get all this from? It's from the Protestants. They're the ones who started this back in the early 1900s, and they let the women be bishops, they let them be the elders in the church, they let them do this, that, and the other thing. And this ecumenism, when it occurred in the 1960s, well, the Protestants brought all that baggage into the Catholic Church, and that's when we started to accept it. You see, the same thing has been happening for 500 years.
I wonder how it actually began, where was the first weakness that it actually started coming in? Because we were so strong at one time.
We were. Now there's other instances where we've stemmed the tide, because the Protestants approved contraception in the 1930s. The Anglican Church was the first one to approve contraception for all the members of the church. And Pius XI came out with his encyclical, Costi Connubii, and said, no contraception. Okay, so there, the Catholic Church drew the line. It wasn't going to allow the Protestants to infiltrate. Okay, then Pope Paul VI in 1969 wrote Humanae Vitae, and again, they drew the line. The Catholic Church drew the line, and took a lot of flack for that. But the Church stood up for the truth. But as far as the liturgy is concerned, and worship and music and all that stuff, boy, there's just been an influx from the Protestants, the Charismatics, and the Pentecostals, all that kind of thing, where anything is involved with worship, that's where the curtain has fallen,
Well, now this parish is very beautiful. I mean, St. Anne's is very beautiful. I come from Georgia, and there's so many churches there that we were called Roman Catholics because we go from church to church trying to find and here in St. Adelaide, it's just wonderful, I think. And it's a beautiful community also. But I hate to say anything against it, and I'm doing it now. If my friends in Georgia could see me, they would believe it's me. But holding hands, I have been told you're not supposed to hold hands during the Our Father, because our purpose in holding hands is to show our unity. And I was told that our unity is our belief in the Blessed Sacrament. All of us believe the same thing. Amen. And the holding of the hands is incorrect. And I never did it in Georgia. I would always go into deep prayer, and so I could avoid it there. But here you can't, because there's so many, everybody does it.
Yes, you can, just don't hold your hand out.
Yeah, and I gotta admit, now that I'm doing it, I don't mind it at all. But it's really not correct for the Catholic, it's not part of the Catholic Mass, correct?
No, it's not.
No, it's not.
As far as Eucharistic ministers, I thought that the reason that we had women is because there weren't enough.
Right, and then they restore it all extraordinary, but they don't use that phrase anymore.
Now they're ordinary.
Take maybe one more question, we'll wrap it up.
I had a question and I got sidetracked.
Oh.
No.
All right, we'll take two. We'll take his.
This is real quick. This is real quick.
According to the what I have heard about the cups during the after the consecration of the wine that becomes the blood of Christ, is there some truth to saying that the blood of Christ is not supposed to be in anything else but a golden cup?
Yes.
That it's not supposed to be in glass or anything like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And why is it that
I don't know if that's been changed or not, but I
it has, because our church does it.
Well, they might be just doing it. I'm not saying that the Vatican actually approved that change. I'm just saying
Well,
that might be.
something recently came out to the diocese or the churches. They can continue using their crystal until it's gone. When it's broken, they have to go back to
we were using nothing but
right, but it was just recently in the last
saw that
couple
too.
months. They have to go back to the gold chalices, but they can use these until they break.
From where?
And then not replace.
From where does this come?
From the diocese.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like President Bush saying we can still use those stem lines because they already exist.
Yeah, my question is, I've seen several priests during seasonal during the church year, they all wear their purple robes or purple, or whatever color the season of the church is, but there's one priest in particular, I noticed he never wears anything to the color of that season.
Yeah.
He's colorblind.
I'm surprised we don't see more of that. He's
I
colorblind.
mean, is it, aren't they supposed to wear?
Oh, yeah, there's been no change in that, yeah. I think in California, I've seen more changes out here than I do back east, where I live. Yeah, this is a land of innovation out here.
Like during reconciliation, aren't they supposed to wear like the stoles?
Yeah, something's wrong, yeah. If you see anything out of the ordinary, your suspicion is something's wrong. Okay, all right. Yes, ma'am.
Make this last. There used to always be an imprimatur, and then what was it, Nihil?
A Nihil Obstat?
Then that dropped away and it was just the imprimatur.
No, that's still
Now, I thought the Nihil, or whatever it is, that was really very important. And the imprimatur was important. Now, the imprimatur is just saying there's nothing contrary to our faith.
Well, actually, the way it works is you get the Nihil Obstat first. And that's because the censor of the bishop reads your material and approves it for the bishop. Okay, so the bishop now has the authority.
Right.
Well, no, he has the authority, but he now rubber stamps that and says, okay, I approve it because my censor gave it the Nihil Obstat, so I'm going to give it the imprimatur. The bishop is the one that gives it the imprimatur.
Now, the first thing that the imprimatur just says there's nothing contrary to our faith.
Nothing against Catholic doctrine in this book, yes.
But they don't have the Nihil anymore. They don't show that, right? They just show
No, but if they don't have it, it means they should have it. There still is a Nihil Obstat, and then they get the imprimatur. It's a two-step process. Because the bishop's not going to read it himself. He's going to give it to somebody else to read.
So if you see the imprimatur,
What's that?
if you see that it says imprimatur, then it's okay to read that book, right?
Well, yes and no. Okay, the imprimatur is not the same. Yeah, the imprimatur means that the censor of the church has determined that there's nothing stated in the book that's against Catholic doctrine, established Catholic doctrine. Okay, but with a lot of other things in life, just like a lot of other things in life, there's a certain dilution that has occurred with what an imprimatur meant 5 decades ago and what an imprimatur means today. Okay, there's a lot of books out there today with an imprimatur that are approved by a bishop and his censor who are very liberal-minded. Okay, who allow a lot of liberal thinking to go through and and come out in the books we read. Okay, that happens today. All right, so
it doesn't mean anything.
Well, it means something. Okay, but it doesn't depend on the imprimatur itself. It depends on who's behind the imprimatur.
So you got to find out who the bishop that gave the imprimatur to find out if it's
He needs to know who his censor is.
Yeah, a censor.
Where his censor was
Oh,
educated.
wow, I didn't
and
know
all
that.
yeah.
We could go on this long time. We have bingo here tonight, I got this quite cleaned up, so.
Because it's a new translation, I translated that myself. So they
Thank you, Bob. Thanks all of you for coming and come to our Bible class on Wednesday. We take up these topics in a great amount of detail, don't we, Bob?
Wednesday night, 7 o'clock.
Wednesday night, 7 o'clock.